I'm Dr. Anthony Cave, a Stanford and Harvard-trained anesthesiologist and integrative medicine specialist. And J. Robert Oppenheimer is all over the news. But what we don't talk about in his movie as much as what really affected his life is the brilliant mind that was suffering from depression, addiction, and even anorexia at some points of his life that ultimately led to him dying. And I have so many patients that come to me either before surgery or before a ketamine treatment who are brilliant and so high functioning. They have great jobs, they have strong families, they even have lots of social support. Yet they're eaten alive in this constant state of conflict from depression or anxiety or PTSD. And this opens up under anesthesia. So I want to share with you what I suspect Oppenheimer would have been like under anesthesia. We know that he had surgery for the cancer that ultimately, we believe, took his life, the throat cancer, from his nicotine addiction. And what would he have been like actually has a lot of similarities to what many of my patients today also suffer from. And sometimes it can be prevented so that that suffering doesn't have to be there in the first place. Surgery is hard enough, and the stress of it can often be mitigated. But you first have to understand why the mind and body are connected and how it opens up when the frontal cortex and the other parts of the brain are silenced under anesthesia. So a couple of traits about Oppenheimer that you need to know that you might not hear about in the media as much. Number one was his loneliness. There's a tremendous amount of loneliness everywhere in the population today, but Oppenheimer specifically had a couple of behavioral traits that alienated him from his peers and from his friends and from his teachers and from some family members. So really, what else is left? There's a lot of narcissistic behavior traits that overlap with loneliness and addiction. These three, narcissism, loneliness, and addiction, share some core traits. And in a previous video, I shared with you that the Greeks already knew this thousands of years ago, because the story of Narcissus, who was a young man who died because he was so infatuated with his reflection in a lake, was a result of ultimately an addiction in some ways. And remember, addiction is short-term benefit at the expense of long-term harm without the ability to hit the abort button. Narcissus literally wasted away and died because he couldn't take his eyes off of himself in the Greek story. So there's an addictive quality, clearly a self-entitlement, because narcissists, especially have the grandiose flavor, believe that their entitlement is due to inherent or perceived superiority to others. And then the loneliness. Well, remember, Narcissus died alone. He had no friends, nobody. He had actually, Echo loved Narcissus in the story, but Narcissus was so self-infatuated, he ignored Echo. There's a whole story behind Echo and how Echo makes its way into the English language. But the point is that addiction, narcissism, and loneliness, Oppenheimer represented all three. Katie, thank you for that kind super thanks. You are very, very welcome for the video on gaslighting. Many more to come. Now, to be clear, I did not know Oppenheimer. I can't diagnose him, but these stories suggest traits from these three personality types and ultimately pathologies. In fact, he's quoted saying that I need physics more than I need school. As a young man, when he said this, or I think he was a child, that demonstrates that the physics, separate from the social interactions of school and the other maturity aspects of school, weren't as important as the actual subject material itself. When a child or a young individual is saying this, it has to raise some concerns. This is closely related to his sense of entitlement. He grew up in a very rich family and was reported to be very pretentious, and he was bullied. There's a horrible story of him being stripped naked and being thrown into an icebox. That's really sad, and I'm not condoning that at all, right? But there's likely, these things rarely occur in silos, and this bullying and the pretentious nature may have all been overlapped, certainly works its way into his adult psyche, which we'll get to in a minute. Number three is you have to know that he was always distractible. And you might be thinking, how can somebody so accomplished also be distractible? Oppenheimer, from all the reports, was distractible in the sense that he was always chasing after trendy topics, trendy research topics, or later on in his life, trendy political moves. He always wanted to be at the center of things, wanted to chase what was fashionable at the time, some level of attention seeking, which also overlaps with some narcissistic behaviors. Once again, I wasn't there to diagnose him, but these are what goes into the brain that are going to explain where he ends up later on in his life, at least to an extent. Donna, thank you for that super thanks. Very kind of you. And Shane, your question is absolutely ridiculous. I don't know how you want me to respond to that. I agree with what Dr. Zero says. Moving on. Rejection. Rejection was a big part of Oppenheimer's life. As a young man, he was rejected by certain professors in his academic pursuits. He was rejected when one of his close friends ended up getting engaged to somebody else. He felt like his friend had abandoned him. In fact, he even had so much resentment towards others that he tried to poison one of his tutors at Cambridge. He wasn't charged with murder because he had apparently some money to grease the wheels from his father, but this is a degree of jealousy that can arise from rejection and loneliness and a sense of underappreciation that also colors the mind of this brilliant yet really haunted individual. And the last two that are going to tie this all together are that his self-destructive natures were very, very clear, partly from humiliation, which happened later on in his life after he lost his military security clearance in the 1950s. So this is a man who's devoted so much of his life to the military service. Now it's stripped from him over arguments and ultimately pissing off many others. But he actually also had self-regret in some ways, or shame. It's hard to know which one. They are different. But blood on my hands was something that he did repeat several times. And the self-destructive behaviors that accumulated from this lifetime of hurt resulted in some anorexic qualities. He ended up around 115 pounds. This guy's 6 foot. His nicotine addiction was so bad, he would smoke up to 100 cigarettes a day, reportedly. Now, I see no reason why not. It says, let's pathologize each other. This is not to pathologize Oppenheimer. It's to explain the next part. Under anesthesia, I mean, this man died from a nicotine addiction, we believe, from throat cancer, oropharyngeal cancer. And what would have possibly made his course better? What may have saved him? Of course, I can't be certain. But for those of us who are alive, we can learn lessons from this. I'm not pathologizing him. No reason why not, to be clear. But we want to help prevent self-destruction in ourselves and our loved ones as much as possible. So let's look at the loneliness that we talked about and that sense of entitlement, that pretentiousness. When patients come for surgery, they're often, especially if they have narcissistic behaviors, it's very easy for them to piss off their care team. A common phrase that I've shared before, which is quite hurtful, is for a patient in extremis, meaning they're under a lot of stress, to tell their doctor or nurse, I wish you could feel the pain that I feel so that you knew what it felt like to be suffering like me. This is not a healthy way to connect with somebody, not a healthy way to explain your pain to someone, not a productive way to get the pain treatment that you deserve. Of course, anyone after surgery or at any point deserves to have their pain treated. But when people who are so lonely, often because of narcissistic personality behaviors, begin to treat others like that, this will sink the care team interaction. It will alienate you in times of greatest need from those that are trying to help you. When patients go home after surgery, after they leave the hospital, especially after a major surgery, you can't walk sometimes. You can't move your extremities, your arms, your legs. You might not be able to eat properly. This is a time when you need to really dig into your trusting relationships with others. And when we alienate those that we love through these behavioral traits, it really can increase the risk of surgical complications and healing complications after. There's also an issue about trust, because when you're going under anesthesia, when patients feel alienated from me, which I hope happens very rarely, but it does happen because I can't control everything. The less trust the patient has in their doctor, the less they're able to heal during that vulnerable time. What do I mean by that? This is very real. When patients fall asleep in a distrusting, uncomfortable environment, they don't know their anesthesiologist, maybe they don't trust their surgeon, or they don't know them very well, they don't know the other individuals in the room, they're uncertain if the surgery will be helpful, they doubt whether this is even the right surgery for them in the first place. Maybe they have not come to peace with the fact that they need this surgery. These prime the mindset in a way that might respond adversely to anesthesia and how they wake up and how their recovery goes for weeks after. When an individual is falling asleep in a sense of peace, tranquility, trust, this primes the mindset to wake up, for example, with less pain, with less chance of emergence delirium, meaning less kicking, screaming, crying, being emotional, with less chance of complications like blood clots and surgical site infections. It's not guaranteed, but it lowers the risk. The next part about the distractibility, the constantly chasing after what is trendy. How does this show up in patients under anesthesia? Distractibility is very closely tied in some ways to attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. One of the hallmarks of impulsivity control or deranged impulsivity control is not being able to focus our efforts. And this shows up in many neurodivergent conditions. ADHD is just a very common one. So if you can't control your impulses, you end up doing things that you might regret later on. It's no mistake or no coincidence that impulse control deficiencies have a tremendous overlap with risky behaviors, including substance use disorders, nicotine being one of the most addictive substances known to mankind. Therefore, is it a surprise that someone suffering like JR Oppenheimer had such a strong addiction to nicotine that ultimately we believe led to his oropharyngeal cancer, his throat cancer? Probably not. But recognize that when individuals have such self-harming, I mean, his friends called him self-destructive, right? From not eating, from being stuck in these workaholic episodes where he wouldn't take care of his basic needs. This does show up under anesthesia because when patients who are highly distractible are waking up and trying to heal after, they're more likely to not focus on the core of healing. I don't want to sound all out there, but there's a tremendous difference between an individual who has impulse control deficiencies and is likely to begin, for example, smoking after surgery. We know that smoking, for example, will slow down wound healing. Alcohol will also slow down wound healing. And it's not blaming the impulse control deficiency, but recognizing that it's there because of numerous other suffering, hurts, and pains. When patients wake up and they have not addressed their impulse control before falling asleep, it will make their recovery harder because they're more likely to continue with risky behaviors that will tank their surgical healing. It might take longer, there might be more complications, etc. Red Zon's asking a question: what's worse, suffering from cerebral chemical imbalance like Oppenheimer had, or an adult physiology issue due to youth having a lot of cortisol release? Red Zon, well, that's a very good question. In short, I can't tell you because each of those two conditions have so many subtypes and flavors. And more importantly, the environment surrounding each one will likely play a bigger role in what the long-term trajectory of that individual is. For example, you may have a cortisol imbalance, or you might have any number of chemical imbalances that Oppenheimer had. But if you are in the presence of a loving, caring social support system, those can be addressed in many cases. And how they are addressed can lead to incredibly different divergence of what the long-term trajectory is. In the absence of those trusting, loving relationships, either one of them may be doomed. I'm not saying it's all or nothing, but realistically, without trust and love and compassion from those around us, nearly any condition prognosis is made significantly worse. Very good question. And Heidi, good to see you. So skate, surfer, snowboarder, good to see you. And we are talking about cortisol, one of the many stress hormones. That's right. And Jody Miller, Oppenheimer, the father, so-called father of the atomic bomb, that's who we're talking about here today because of the recent movie, the Christopher Nolan movie that's come out. So let's wrap this up here. Depression is also certainly what Oppenheimer suffered from and also has a huge impact on anesthesia when it's unmitigated. When somebody goes under anesthesia with significant depression, there's a couple major issues. One is the medications they are taking for depression. These will impact how anesthesia influences the brain, how much anesthesia you need, how long it takes for it to wear off, etc. Possible interactions, possible dangerous interactions. Serotonin syndrome being just one of them. These can often be very heavily mitigated. I'm not saying you should be concerned to go under anesthesia as long as you've done everything you can to control your depression and have told your doctor what medications you're taking. But number two is the self prescriptions, if you will, the cannabis, the alcohol, the other substances that are used to help soothe the underlying root causes that are not addressed with the medications for depression. The mind and body are connected. And when the mind and body are seeing other substances to try to cope, these will have tremendous influences and interactions with anesthesia. On top of that, when you wake up after anesthesia in a time of immense vulnerability and stress, not having the right mindset because of untreated depression or untreated anxiety, PTSD, or chronic pain might make the chronic pain worse, but can also increase the risk of complications, including blood clots, surgical site infections, and ultimately the surgery not working, especially if someone is so depressed that they go back to drinking alcohol or using cigarettes in that precious, narrow window of healing after surgery. This is why our mindset, among many other reasons, is so important before we go under anesthesia. Now, the ruminative and perseverative thought patterns that really underlie depression, meaning that many of my patients are always stuck thinking about why did this happen in the past? Why? Or what's going to happen in the future, right? If it's ruminative and perseverative thought pattern loops of the past, we call it depression. If it's of the future, we call it anxiety. When someone falls asleep under anesthesia, consumed by either one of these, how do you think they're going to wake up? People don't rise to their best in stressful moments of vulnerability. They often sink to their worst. I don't mean this in a negative way, but I mean it in that these have serious consequences for the mind and body. We don't want to heal the body and break the mind with anesthesia. We want to heal the body and the mind. And that comes from a trusting relationship, from not being alienated from your care team, from not pushing away those that are trying to care for you and be compassionate towards you. It comes from being able to separate jealousy from self-healing. Instead of looking at others as competition, looking at others as inspiration. Now, I got to say, this does culminate ultimately in eroded self-confidence. When we have so much inner conflict, which is what Oppenheimer's life can be characterized by. Article after article talk about inner conflict, persistent, not only with making the bomb, but even to finish school to get to a point to make the bomb in the Manhattan Project. Inner conflict plagued him for all of his life. And when we have inner conflict, we have eroded self-confidence and self-esteem. When we go under anesthesia, that might lead to us doubting the need for surgery, doubting our ability to heal. If we doubt our ability to heal, it appears to have a very real impact on how long it will take to heal, if we can heal at all, for both psychological and physical conditions. So in the 1960s, when Oppenheimer was ultimately diagnosed with the long-term complications of his very intense nicotine addiction, the throat cancer, how do you think he fell asleep under anesthesia? Internal conflict, self-confidence toward healing, trust and love from a supporting environment? Well, unfortunately, Oppenheimer died relatively alone. His wife had to beg one of his former colleagues to come and speak with him as he was dying, to try to rekindle some love of the science that had driven him for so much of his life. I'm not blaming Oppenheimer any more than I'm blaming any other patients, but unfortunately, there is a trend that I see in so many of my patients today, like 70 years after, that can be prevented. But Oftentimes, patients don't know just how much potential they have to heal themselves. And that's why I want to share the story. Oppenheimer, brilliant, but haunted. So many of you guys might be similar, but please have confidence that there are ways out of these ruminative and perseverative loops. You're not alone. It's real. Don't let anyone gaslight you into thinking that it's all in your head, because even though it's in your head, everything else is in your head as well, and it's equally real. And with trust in your doctor, accepting the compassion of your support environment, and advocating for yourself with the tools that I'd like to share with you on this channel, I really hope that you can find a healer, a doctor, or anyone else to help you overcome these challenges. Like Oppenheimer probably would have benefited from very, very early on in his life, before all the regret and narcissism and addiction, etc., began to tear his life apart and led him kind of towards an inevitable conclusion. Until next time, please remember that you have more power over your health than you've ever been told. And if you appreciate me coming on here for these live streams, do please hit that like button and share what you've learned with others. Your support helps me do this more often for you. Actually, since it's a weekend, I'm going to answer some of your questions. I'll cut these in the final recording that goes on. Straight Talk, No Messing says, I think the higher the stress levels, the more harder it is to find any right form of meditation if you have other health issues. I try to stay away from antidepressants so I don't get hooked. Very, very interesting. So Straight Talk, No Messing. This is why I believe in the right time and place and the power of medications like ketamine. Why I use them, because if someone is so heavily afflicted from the perseverative thoughts of depression or anxiety, or not being able to relieve themselves from the flashbacks and the long-term sequela of traumas, or debilitating chronic pain, we can give them all the meditative scripts we want. I can give them all the guided imagery. I can give them all the Prozac. It's not going to address the root cause. Ketamine or other psychedelics, when used properly, can give somebody a window of hope, can be uplifting enough for a short enough period of time to allow everything else that we've provided to be able to actually stick. If it's not going to stick, if it's a Teflon-coated heart or a Teflon-coated brain, if you will, what does it matter if we give all of these Band-Aid solutions? If we can't literally soften the mind, the heart, whatever resonates with you, so that we can address the root cause. Very good question. Hey, Jody, I'm really happy that you learned live. Linda V says, the S-ketamine is not a panacea. It has to be done forever. Well, Linda, you're absolutely right. There ain't no panacea out there, potentially with the exception of the inner healing potential, which S-ketamine or ketamine or psilocybin or a trusting, loving doctor relationship, or perhaps a spiritual calling, can all help cultivate and catalyze. Teflon brain. Yes, that is what I said, Ills. Hey, Lisa Lacey, you're so welcome. Katie Johnson says, when you said neurodivergent, can folks with autism spectrum disorder be more inclined to having an eating disorder or just ADHD, according to current studies? Katie, what a good question. Personally, I do not know the statistics. However, anyone with impulse control, I believe, is going to be more susceptible to the long-term sequela of any addiction, whether it's addiction to food in place of coping, whether it's addiction to gambling or shopping, whatever it is. When we lack impulse control, it's not blame, but it's recognizing that some part of that individual growing up did not appear to have received perhaps the love and attention and nurturing it needed to be able to strengthen that impulse control part of the brain. There can be many other reasons as well, but I believe that one of the more common reasons is from elements of missing interaction in childhood. Chelsea G says, does a long history of smoking, weed or cigarettes, have an effect on general anesthesia despite quitting 6+ weeks? Yes, Chelsea, they both can have a serious impact on anesthesia. 6 weeks is a good time to quit. That really reduces many of the sequela, at least for cigarettes. Weed, remember, is very, very fat soluble or lipophilic. It will hang around for at least a month 6 weeks is probably safe, but in my experience, and we just don't know enough yet as a medical community, I find that when individuals have been using cannabis for a very long time, something about the brain chemistry is just altered for an extended period of time. And we also see this in paranoia in cases that might lead to a propensity to psychotic disorders later in life. So something appears to still be affected even after the marijuana or cannabis, whatever it is, if it's CBD or THC, has left the system. That being said, if you tell your doctor about what you've done, how often, and when you quit, we will adjust the medications to the best of our ability to keep you safe and comfortable. Donna says that her throat still hurts from last month's surgery. I'm sorry, Donna. Um, I hope that you don't have a necrotic uvula. When I've seen long-term throat pain, sometimes it is from the uvula being um, uh, damaged more than in other surgeries. It's not anyone's fault per se. It can happen for any number of reasons. How about THC gummies and thought stopping for rumination? This is a very, very interesting question about THC or CBD for that matter, being able to help reduce the ruminative and perseverative thoughts that underlie anxiety. There are many studies that show benefit, many studies that don't show benefit, some studies that show harm. That being said, addressing no external chemical, with the exception possibly of psychedelics, is going to help address the root cause of the addiction, of the anxiety, pardon. So maybe you can help turn the volume down on the ruminative and perseverative thought patterns, but it probably won't help for long term addressing the reason why. I hope that makes sense. Red Zon, why are the fatty flesh parts of butt reduced from experiences of lots of stress? I don't follow that question. I'm sorry. Ed, do I know about Dr. Ramani's channel? She talks about narcissism. It'd be lovely to see you in conversation. Maybe I should reach out to her, Ed. I do know her channel. I've watched a little bit of it. It's very interesting. Wouldn't a folic test show how much is left, weed or opiates? Richard Meyer, I'm not aware of anything beyond a urine toxicology screen that might show how much weed or opiates are still left in the body, at least not one in regular clinical use. Skater, surfer, snowboarder. How do you handle staged procedures? The first hopefully gets the bulk of the pain, but good chances I need a second surgery to get everything sorted. Without knowing the specific type of surgery you're referring to, I can't comment specifically. If you put it below, I'll try to answer it. Good question. Anthony, I don't think I've seen you on here before. Does ketamine always cause hallucinations when used for post-surgical pain? Absolutely not. Depends on how it is delivered, the dose, the rate, etc. So when I use ketamine, I try everything I can to reduce the risk of at least harmful or disturbing hallucinations. There might be some auditory changes and visual changes because it is affecting some parts, ultimately where the thalamus is taking in signals from your eyes and other senses. But our goal is that even if they're there, to make sure that they are not harmful or disturbing. Someone asked about ketamine for getting off of sleeping tablets. Nadia, great question. In and of itself, no. With the right support to be able to address why is the sleeping disturbance there. Assuming it's not from sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, some other type of, I don't want to say organic, but if there's not some identifiable cause, if it's insomnia from a psychological condition, ketamine might be very helpful, but it has to be delivered in a way that addresses the psychological condition, not just going to a rave and using it as a party drug, not just going into a room and giving it an IV of ketamine and expected for this to magically solve all problems. No. If you're telling me that you're integrating a ketamine experience, you're using the right herbal therapies, if appropriate, you're addressing your integration with a therapist, you're journaling, and maybe you're doing artwork, you're using the ketamine as a catalyst to uncover your inner healing potential, that's a whole beautiful way to address insomnia. And that's very possible. I've seen it in many patients. Lorraine, I still don't see your intergenerational trauma question. Gosh. Well, I will say that intergenerational trauma is a very real thing. However, However, it is so important to not mix up the victim hat or the victimization from the agents that we do have over our health. And this is what makes me very hesitant to talk about intergenerational trauma, because some will quickly interpret that as, oh, I can't affect what happened before me, so therefore this is why I'm depressed. Well, it may well have influence. However, we are rarely, if ever, doomed based on any genes that we're aware of, certainly, and likely from any past experiences. Remember, if the human brain can overcome nicotine, opioid, alcohol addictions, that leaves the door open for almost anything else to be healed from as well. Because these are some of the most powerful substances known to mankind, and human beings have time and time and time again found ways to quit them cold turkey, as incredible as it sounds. So I would not lose hope about intergenerational trauma ever dooming somebody to a future of suffering. Stay fresh, cheese bags. I don't know what your username refers to, but are people with bipolar or schizophrenia treated differently under anesthesia? Yeah, they probably are. Because we know that young women, we know that immigrants, people of color, people with psychological illness, obese individuals, there's unfortunately, on the average, some implicit biases that lead to people being treated not as well as they should be. I'm going to put it out there. Time and time again, it's been demonstrated. It's been wrong since the beginning of time and continues to this day. That's why I want us, this channel, so you know, I try to break down the stigmas around mental health in sensitive medical settings like surgery so that we can stop this nonsense from perpetuating. Thank you for raising awareness of that. Lorraine says, okay, here we go. My grandmother and many other citizens of my hometown were witnesses without knowledge to the detonation of the atomic bomb at the Trinity site. She was afraid of everything and extremely depressed. Well, Lorraine, you just knocked it square on. If one is raised by parents who are depressed, live in the constant sense of fear and vulnerability, what does that do to the child who is looking to the parent for guidance, for maturity, looking at them for nurturing and care? When parents are consumed in states of conflict, just like what we're talking about with Oppenheimer, their children are going to observe that. And there is an immense amount of not only learning from parents, but also at the same time not receiving the nurturing and guidance that is needed. I personally believe that is one of the immense sources, the greatest, if not the main source of intergenerational trauma. Great question. I don't know the earliest age to be diagnosed with autism, Jody. It's a very good question, but it's likely younger than we think. And that's why screening is so important. Jody Jaffe, with mental illness and prone to hallucinate, do people always hallucinate with anesthesia? No, there are rarely any all or nothings. The mindset that one has before receiving anesthesia might play a much bigger role than anything else in the surgery setting. What's the recovery time from ketamine? Pickled Tink. I like your username. I don't know what the recovery time is because it depends on the dose, on the duration of use, on the other circumstances around ketamine. So it depends on many factors. Was it oral? Was it IV? Was it intramuscular? Was it intranasal? Each of those has a different half-life. Great question. Very good question. Well, Judy Miller, 13 is often older than need be. It's usually in the single digits, early single digits. Excellent. Well, I appreciate everyone who came here to learn. If you actually, you guys let me know if you want me to keep this question and answer section in the final video, I'm happy to do so. I just don't want it to drag on for individuals who are watching this after the video is done. Please fill out the poll so we can talk about another topic next week as well. And I look forward to your wonderful comments for ideas for the next videos. Until next time.